All right, and we're good. I think we're good. All right, so how are you doing today, my friend?
Oh man, I'm doing great, brother. How about yourself?
Pretty good. I'm excited to talk about this. It's a little bit overdue. Those videos came out a couple weeks ago. So, for everyone watching, this is a sort of response to a particular YouTuber who made some videos about us, Eclectic Media. He's been on YouTube for a really long time, 10 years plus probably. And so he made a video about my buddy here called Monistic Idealism Defeated on his attack against property dualism. And then he made a video about me, why strong emergence is not magic. So if you aren't familiar, we're both idealists. Eclectic Media is a property dualist, and we've been having these exchanges back and forth for a while. And we're here to respond to some of the claims in the videos because we think that they kind of need to be addressed. And at the end, I have a particular argument against strong emergence that I'm going to present. I think it's pretty good, and I definitely am looking forward to hearing Eclectic Media's response to our points in this video, and then that argument I give at the end. So first, we can. Do you want to start with the video he did about you?
Yeah, sure. So, my initial claim is that the mind being a mere property of the brain, while also being over and above the brain, is contradictory. So, his objection to this is that it's vague, and he just doesn't quite understand what's being said. And in the video, he leaves out the quote from John Searle, which does elucidate what's going on here. So I'm just going to read it to you real fast. He says, if you consider uncontroversial properties of the brain, like weight, shape, color, solidity, nobody says that these arise from or are over and above the brain. And only in a special sense can some of them be described as emergent, and certainly not as emergent from the brain. The official claim is that consciousness is a property, not a thing, object, or substance. But that claim is inconsistent with the conception of consciousness as something that is over and above, that the brain gives rise to. And he says this in his paper, Why I Am Not a Property Dualist. So to further expand on this, we think of properties as being of something in that it is a feature, characteristic, or aspect of the entity which bears it. Properties, so understood, are not over and above the entity. The entity is over and above the properties and bears the properties. And if the mental is irreducible, but it has no irreducible mental entity to bear them, well, then it doesn't make any sense as to how it could be a property if it is to be over and above. I'm almost reminded of this, old Mitch Hedberg joke where he says he's going to get a tattoo of himself, but taller. It just doesn't really make any sense.
I love him.
So, and he talks about life. He gives an example of this with life. And I think you did a really good job example of explaining how complex systems and all that stuff is actually a good example of weak emergence, not strong emergence. So do you have something to add to that?
Yeah. So just for the first claim that you just talked about, where he claimed the whole property thing is vague, and then yeah. So if you think it's vague, then fine, right? But that's not like really an objection. If you want more clarification, then that's what we're here for. But then he says Searle begs the question. But he doesn't. I mean, there's no begging the question occurs begging the question occurs in any case where there's an objection to the premise, which is also the same objection to the conclusion, and the that premise doesn't have any independent justification. So that's not what he does there. What he basically does is similar to saying like hey, like my house has 2 stories, and then Eclectic Media is like, oh, you're begging the question because you just asserted it. It's like, well, no, it's like I mean, most people don't most people don't talk in the way I think that he wants people to talk. But yeah, I think you make a really good point about the whole over and above thing, because yeah, it's weird to imagine properties being over and above the entity that they're a property of, because the whole point of an entity is to be over and above the properties, unless you're a bundle theorist, right? like a bundle theorist would say that a substance is just a collection of properties, so it's nothing over and above the properties. But if you're like a substratum theorist, where there's a substrata that bears the properties, then that substrata would have to be distinct from the properties, and so it would be the bearer, like you said, and so it would be over and above the properties. So if either you're a bundle, in Eclectic Media has said before, he's in the bundle theorist. So it's just weird to think of a property that way. And he right after that, he talks about he questions how you use the word irreducible, and he thinks that like you're using the word irreducible to mean like metaphysical identity or something weird. I don't understand that part at all. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he's saying there as well, because especially when you look at the context of, maybe getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because he mentions things like existentially separate and ontologically distinct, and he uses these terms, which seems to muddy the waters all the more, because he wants to say the mental is irreducible, but then he'll say things like it's not ontologically distinct, and you're like, well, hold on a second. To be reducible is to be, in a sense, nothing more than the phenomenon you're saying that it is. If you want to say, for instance, the mind is the brain, you're saying the mind is nothing more than the brain, or that it's just the chemicals or the processes of it. It's not over and above. It's not something more than, like it's producing something else. It's just the brain. That's what it is to be reducible. And to say it's not reducible is to say it's more. So I'm not really sure what he means by that, but
yeah, I guess I'm gonna have to try to give him
as well.
I'm gonna have to try to give him the benefit of the doubt, because like he has said before in comments and stuff that you know that the mind is ontologically distinct. It's in its own separate ontological category. But then like it's weird that he says in this video that the mind is not in an existentially separate or ontologically separate domain, which that seems like it would just be entailed by the view that. To me, I take ontologically distinct and ontologically separate domain to be basically the same thing. So I guess he doesn't. But yeah, that's weird. You did mention the correlation between weak emergence and then complex systems theory. I think I want to save that. I might want to save that for when we talk about my video, because he does go into that a little bit more in the video he does about me and Jason Barr.
Okay, cool. That'll be a good idea. Then the points you'll make there will also be relevant to his example about life when he goes over to that as well. So there'll just be a bit of a two birds, one stone situation there then.
Sure.
So I guess objection number 2.
This is the collapse, the collapse into substance dualism, I believe, correct? Or is that...
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. So I claim that property dualism lapses into substance dualism. And you can see in the comments I give several arguments why. And so here's a quote from Eclectic Media. He says, "You confer substancehood on properties, i.e., because those parts are a part of a substance, they are thereby substances in their own right." And another commenter by the name of Tyler Litch says that I'm wrong about properties being all there is to substance. And I just wanted to correct these two and say I'm not claiming either of those things. What I am saying is that substratum theory demands that properties have a substrata to bear properties, and that since properties are part or all of the metaphysical nature of the substance, then the metaphysical nature of the substrata must be either partly or wholly mental, since the properties are mental. So just as there is a physical substrata to bear physical properties, there would thereby be a mental substrata to bear mental properties. And this is somewhat relevant to my first objection as well, that you're going to need something there to bear it. And for it to be over and above is to not really make any sense. And so Schneider's somewhat echoing this by saying, according to substratum theory, you're going to end up being a substance dualist. You will end up having a dualism of entities instead of a mere dualism of properties. And so that's what I would say to correct him right there.
Yeah, I think you made some pretty good points there. And it's funny because in the video, when he addresses this claim, like the first thing he says is that he doesn't even understand like what the argument is, and like he basically flat out says that he's like I don't see what he's trying to say here, and like I've tried to explain this I think he said that in a comment to me, and I've tried to explain it to him before, and he basically said that this commits like the fallacy of division, saying that like the part in mereology, like the part must have a quality of the whole or something, but that's not what we're saying. So like in a comment, I guess I can throw it up on screen share. That I don't know if it'll be very easy to read or not, but so this will go a little bit into the video later too, because when he mentions me in the video with me and Jason Barr, and he addresses a portion of this this thread where I talk about complexity being a cop out as an explanation for strong emergence, but he avoids most of my like strongest arguments. He just picks out that one and then just makes a whole video about it. But so I basically try to explain the distinction. I try to explain this argument to him, this collapse argument. And so I say, if we take properties to be metaphysical constituents of substances, then what that means is that the properties constitute part of the nature of the substance. And so this gets into the question of what a nature is. And so a nature, I guess I could talk about it in like Thomistic terms, even though it doesn't need to be. Like you could say that there are forms, right? And there are properties or something, same forms and properties. So a nature is just a collection of properties that make a particular thing what it is, or something like that. So like the nature of a human is like a rational animal, you could say. So rational is a form or a property, animality is a property, and the nature of a human is just those properties. So a nature is just a collection of properties. And so if you have so based on that, if you have this entity and it has physical properties, but then it also has mental properties, and those mental properties are ontologically distinct. They're ontologically different. And those mental properties are constituents of this thing's nature. Then that all that means is that the nature of this thing is partially ontologically mental. And I try to give a more simple kind of explanation here. I say if X is ontologically physical, and X is a part of the metaphysical nature of Y, then Y's metaphysical nature is partially ontologically physical. It just follows because of what a nature is. The nature is just what a thing is. So if part of what a thing is ontologically mental, then part of what a thing is ontologically mental, right? It just follows. So
right. I mean,
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, pardon me. I mean, Susan Schneider makes this really clear in her paper. To quote her directly, she says, in contrast to the bundle theory, the substratum theory holds that objects' natures are not exhausted by their properties.
Yeah.
Over and above their properties, substances have substrata, a core that bears properties, but is not itself a property. So to stay consistent with the main theories that we have in metaphysics today, which is what he's going for, he wants to have this substance property relation as is held out there. I mean, if he wants to stay consistent, then he can't hold a property as over and above. It's the entity that must be over and above. But he can't do that if he holds to property irreducibility, unless he becomes a substance dualist. It's the only option. Were you looking for something? Okay, so he may have dropped. I don't know if anyone can hear me. So in the meantime...
Oh, my mic was muted. Wow.
Okay.
Okay, so like I was just saying...
Fine. Okay,
I muted it so just to make sure that that I didn't give any big background noise or anything. Okay, so what's happening is like my mouse is like invisible, so it's gonna be a little bit hard for me to like navigate, but I think I can deal with that. Some minor technical difficulties.
Oh yeah. Sorry for the dead air, folks. It's all good.
Yeah. And so again, just one last point before we move on to the, this point on this collapse argument. When he brings it up, he basically he gives the argument, your argument, and then he questions it, and then at the end he just says this is like stupid nonsense, and then he just moves on. Like he doesn't even like try to like refute the argument. He says like it seems like what he's doing is this. This is obviously nonsense, and then he just moves on to the next objection, which is the interaction problem objection. So like so many of these things are just like he doesn't understand the argument, or he just dismisses it. And,
Right.
And yeah, so I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, yeah, that about wraps it up because that happens quite a lot actually, and that's actually a good description of what's happening here. But so we can move on to objection 3.
And I believe that is the interaction objection, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I argue that property dualism suffers from the mind-body problem, in if not the same, a very, very similar way as substance dualism. And so he takes this quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and he tries to deflate what's being said in this quote by saying it's just a question, but he fails to realize that it's a rhetorical question. Okay, the quote is referring to arguments against substance dualism, where it asks, how does a non-physical property interact with a physical property? And that very quote is referring to section 2.1, where it shows what the problems are with a nexus with the substance dualist. Okay, and William Lycan, who's a well-known physicalist and philosopher here, echoes this as well. Here's a quote from him. Interaction. The problem is widely thought to be fatal to substance dualism, but there is no obvious difference in the case of property dualism. How could a non-physical property causally affect physical ones any more than could a non-physical substance? End quote. So he tries to answer this by saying that the brain is a nexus, but he's not learning the lessons of history. Descartes held the brain, or at least a part of the brain, as a nexus as well. But as we all know, this didn't get him out of the interaction problem. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the pineal gland is a tiny organ in the center of the brain that played an important role in Descartes' philosophy. He regarded it as the principal seat of the soul and the place in which all our thoughts are formed. And, it's from this one called Descartes and the Pineal Gland. So Descartes simply saying the pineal gland is a nexus didn't get him out of the interaction problem. It didn't explain at all how this non-physical substance interacts with the physical substance. And similarly, I don't see how Eclectic Media saying the brain is a nexus would all of a sudden get him out of the interaction problem. Saying the brain is a nexus doesn't really explain how it's possible for this aspatial, atemporal property to somehow affect temporal and spatial properties and vice versa. So another way he does try to dissolve this problem is by saying the mind is a mere property, and so it is not existentially separate or subsisting in an ontologically distinct domain, as we brought up earlier. But this commitment to property irreducibility contradicts this, and Searle and Schneider pointed this out already. Since he holds the mental to be irreducible, then it is ontologically distinct from the physical. And from here, we're just right back to the old mind-body problem of how the non-physical interacts with the physical. You can change the word substance to property, but it's still the same question at the end of the day. So whether it's a property or substance doesn't matter. Downward causation doesn't really help us here at all, especially since it will entail a commitment to causal transitivity. Because when you think about how downward causation works, especially with supervenience, it is epiphenomenalism. So I want to define supervenience first. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as well. A set of properties A supervenes upon another set B, just in case no two things can differ with respect to A properties, without also differing in respect to their B properties. So in slogan form, there cannot be an A difference without a B difference. So the A in this instance would be the mental, and the B would be the physical, since the mental would supervene on the physical. So the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy identifies that the causal exclusion problem is targeting specifically this form of property dualism. And so this is they argue this is what falls prey exactly to this argument of mental causation. So here's a quote from them. It says, "The causal exclusion principle is fashioned to directly confront this supervenience model of mental causation. Indeed, sometimes the causal exclusion problem is called the supervenience argument, indicating that supervenience-based solutions are clear targets of the causal exclusion principle." And so here's a good way to show that he falls right into epiphenomenalism. So he wants to claim that the mental has novel causal powers, but what he wants and what he gets are two different things. He holds to downward causation, so he wants to say that things like M, the mental, causes P star, which is this other physical effect. But M is itself caused by the initial P, and P is sufficient for P star. And so there's no reason at all to not just hold the physical as doing all the causal work, because in order for there to be another mental event, there would have to be a change in the physical base because of supervenience. So first, you go from M to P star to M star. But the initial M is caused by P. So his own commitment to causal transitivity means he has to be an epiphenomenalist, since it is the physical that has priority. So there's really no way out of this, especially if he wants to be holding on to supervenience. And so, is there anything else that you'd want to add to this?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a pretty strong argument. And it makes sense with like this, like the nature of supervenience. Like if the mind is a thing that's supervenient, then that cannot change unless there's any change in the brain, which is the subvenient base, right? So any of the things that it's even going to do, even if it has causal powers, anything that it is going to do, it has to be caused by the brain. And so like I think what that argument is kind of good, because it really sets that up as it's either epiphenomenalism, or it's just like this unnecessary, like the mental is basically just like this unnecessary third man that you can just cut out and then just have physicalism. Or if you still try to like insist somehow that it has causal powers, then I think you're probably just going to end up having overdetermination. Yeah, and honestly, like how does the supervenience relation even like take place? Like how, like you can say that there is a relation, but like how do you explain the existence of the relation in the first place? I guess he's going to appeal to, again, he's going to go into that complex systems theory, I guess, which we'll get into later. But so that's I think that's all I have on that. I think was that was the last point, right? The causal transitivity thing. That was the last point.
Well, there was a bonus objection as well. Actually, okay. There's a fifth one. This is more in the comments as well, which, by the way, you can see a lot of these arguments in the comments of the videos we're referring to. So, Eclectic Media, he tries to say an immaterial substratum would have no metaphysical adhesion. What I mean by this is there is no metaphysical glue that would attach immaterial properties to an immaterial substratum. Think of gluing an idea onto an immaterial screen. It's incoherent. A substratum requires a boundary. Immaterial phenomena are incorporeal, end quote. He said this to me on two different occasions, and I've responded the same way each time. And here's what happens. Either he just does not respond to me, or he engages in a blatant red herring and changes the subject despite me trying to bring it back to the argument. What I want to note to him are two things. One, he's failed to provide any reason for us to believe why this whole concept of substance and adhesion and glue is true. He just says it's true. And two, I'm not sure how his concept of metaphysical adhesion or glue can be reconciled with property dualism, since I'm not seeing how an immaterial property can be glued to a physical property or substance. If you need spatiality to have a boundary and to be attached, well, then I'm not seeing how the mental can possibly be a property of the physical, or how they can even interact for that matter. So, I mean, he seems to have fallen on his own sword here. I'm not sure what his response is to that. I've been trying to get one from him, but hopefully this will give him time to respond. But I guess those are my main responses to his objections to my video. So I guess we can move on to any other notes you'd have on that, and your arguments on strong emergence.
Yeah, I think I just remembered I don't think you touched on it, but this is something I did want to say is the whole idea. Well, you did talk about the pineal gland and how that fails as a nexus, right? So the property dualist view shouldn't have any better luck finding a nexus. And I said to you before we started is this. That the idea that the brain is a nexus on property dualism and that this is like explanatorily sound, I just don't find that convincing at all, because you can't it doesn't make any sense to say that that the nexus for physical and non-physical interaction is just plain old physical. Like for there to be a nexus between something non-physical and physical, it would have to be like both physical and non-physical, which seems just like a contradiction. Or it would have to maybe you could say it's neither. But then I feel like at that point you're kind of collapsing into some sort of like neutral monism or something. But yeah, in a similar way, Christ is considered like he's considered a mediator, right? And generally he's considered to be in a hypostatic union. So he's fully man and fully God, right? You can't really have a true mediator between man and God if the mediator isn't fully man and fully God. If it's fully God, then it's not a mediator, and if it's just fully man, then it's not a mediator either. It needs to be fully man. And so in a similar way, that's the kind of logic I'm working with, is that if the brain is going to be a nexus for this physical and non-physical interaction, it can't just be a plain old physical thing. Because that doesn't explain how does the brain serve as a nexus for the non-physical if it's just physical. And then he says, well, it's a property. But then we go into all those problems that you mentioned. So it's like I just think if you're gonna have a nexus, saying it's just plain old physical, it just doesn't work. It's just kind of absurd to me. And so yeah, that's the thought I had. And then if you have anything else to say, you could say that, share. And then I guess we can move on to his video about me and Jason Barr.
Yeah, I guess this is just more of a question for him that can be put out there. I'm wondering how he feels about strong artificial intelligence, because I'm wondering why he limits this to the brain, as you kind of alluded to earlier. Because where exactly is this limit of complexity where if you reach this amount, now you have consciousness and so forth. So why is it just the brain? I mean, does he think robots can one day be conscious? Does he think maybe the bar is a bit lower than we think? Are there things is there what it is like to be a thermostat? Is there what it is like to be a computer? Where exactly is he drawing this line as to the emergence of consciousness, and how does he get that? I'm just not sure exactly. So I guess that's something he can try to answer for us in the future.
No, sorry. I keep forgetting. I keep forgetting I mute myself because I'm just trying to make sure there's no background noise. That's a good point. That's a good question. So I suppose that we should now move on to his video about me and Jason Barr. I don't really know Jason Barr that well. So since I'm not going to be really focusing on any of the arguments against Jason Barr, because I'm not Jason Barr. I'm a self-centered bastard. So I want to focus on me, right? So, so first, he brings up a one of my comments about complexity being a cop out complexity as an explanation for emergence being a cop out, because there is no in all the examples of emergence we see, which are really weak emergence, we never see a gap crossing between we never see the crossing of a qualitative gap. Like anything that's weakly emergent from something quantitative is just also going to be quantitative. And so he just takes that, and like the rest of my comment had a bunch of other arguments, which I think were like the saying like complexity is a cop out. That's not really even an argument. That's just kind of like my opinion, I guess. But he just kind of didn't really address any of the arguments that I put in my comment. And so one of the things is, he starts off the video just talking about that, and he then for like the next couple minutes he just reads definitions, which is good, you know. So again, I'm gonna put these videos in the description for people to watch. But yeah, so he kind of reads the description, the definitions of weak emergence and strong emergence, and I don't think he actually uses like a philosophy of mind like website or anything to actually read the definitions off of. It was I forget what it was called, but I like to use Chalmers, right? Because I think Chalmers is a pretty good source for that, and he has an article on emergence, so I'll probably screen share that in a bit. So essentially, weak emergence occurs in any case where there's a low level domain and a high level domain like emerges from a low level domain. And the high level domain, facts about or truths about the high level domain are in principle deducible. Well, you know what? How about I'm just gonna read the actual definition because I'm butchering this. So whoops. Let me put the screen share on just so anyone else can see it here.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, so I got my mouse back. Excellent. So the okay, so sorry, I keep stuttering. We can say that a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible even in principle from truths in the low-level domain. And so when he talks about when Chalmers talks about supervenience, he talks about strong emergence and supervenience. He talks about it as a natural supervenience and not logical supervenience. Because as we know, I don't want the infinite regress there. That's not good. Chalmers gives this argument about the possibility of a p-zombie world, right? And so that's basically saying like eliminative materialism is a possible world. And if you accept that, then it would be the case that consciousness is not logically supervenient but naturally supervenient. And that's what Chalmers says. But this is kind of a side point. But if it's only naturally supervenient, and if it's only naturally supervenient, to me it's kind of a brute fact. If we can have a physically identical possible world that has no consciousness in it, so imagine an eliminativist, materialist possible world which is physically identical to ours but doesn't have consciousness in it, then why does one world have consciousness and the other doesn't? Like, to me it's kind of like a brute fact, but that's just kind of a side point. So I kind of got distracted. So I read the definition of strong emergence. But weak emergence is that we can say that a high-level phenomenon is weakly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are unexpected, given the principles governing the low-level domain. Strong emergence and weak emergence both posit emergent phenomenon as having like novel properties, and this is what Eclectic Media talks about in his video. But they define novelty different. So weak emergence talks of novelty as unexpectedness, right? But it's still in principle deducible. If you had knowledge of like initial conditions and the basic laws of things, you could just deduce. That's what Chalmers says. Let me scroll down a little bit. He says, he's like, I've argued that given a complete catalog of physical facts about the world, supplemented by a complete catalog of facts about consciousness, a Laplacian superbeing could, in principle, deduce all high-level facts about the world, including the high-level facts about chemistry, biology, and economics, and so on. If this is right, then phenomena in these domains may be weakly emergent from the physical, but they are not strongly emergent. So he wants to make the distinction between weak emergence and strong emergence, which is good. The problem is that, for one, he says, so he tries to explain how the mind can strongly emerge by appealing to basically everything that just weak emergence says by itself. So so when he talks about consciousness arising or being emergent, he's not saying anything special compared to weak emergence, and that's an argument that I gave, and then he says I begged the question. But even if he was correct, I wasn't begging the question. It's that it would be a bare assertion, if it was anything. But it's not. It's like again, it's like saying oh, how many stories is your house? Oh, it's 2 stories. Oh, well, you're begging the question because you didn't justify. It's like, come on, man. It's like it's like not everything is like. That's just not how conversation. That's not how language works. So
you're just gonna assume it's not 3 stories, bro.
Yeah, I know. You're just begging the question. You're begging a question against skyscrapers, dude. I mean, come on. So yeah, that's kind of what he does. It's kind of annoying, but anyway, he says I need to substantiate this claim. It's almost like saying it's almost like asking me to prove a negative. Like everything he says about the emergence of consciousness is just compatible with weak emergence, and there's nothing about what he says that is specific to strong emergence. And then you could just say I'm having you could just say I'm having a bare assertion here, but that's I don't even know how that's just based on the definitions of what these things are. It's like saying oh, like being a square is compatible with being a rectangle, and then you say, well, that's begging the question. You're not justifying that. Well, it's like, no, it's just within the definitions. Like a square can be a rectangle. There's nothing contradictory about that, and it's just in the definitions. Like there's no more like explanation required for that. So it's like but I'm kind of going off in the deep end here. So here is something that I find kind of funny. So Chalmers says right here that weak emergence is the notion of emergence that is most common in recent scientific discussions of emergence, and is the notion that is typically invoked by proponents of emergence in complex systems theory. Now, what does Eclectic Media talk about at the very end of this video with me and Jason Barr? He goes over this complex systems theory, and here's a Wikipedia page right here for it. And what does he talk about at the end of his video? He talks about system dynamics, complexity, networks, and non-linearity. Look at all of these. That's complexity, networks, non-linearity, emergence, non-linear dynamical systems. So all of the stuff he talks about at the end of the video, talking about how the mind emerges, strongly emerges, all he's talking about is just complex systems theory. But as Chalmers notes, complex systems theory is just what people refer to when talking about weak emergence. So again, his explanations, they're not anything special with regards to strong emergence. All he's describing emergence as is just weak emergence.
Yeah, it sounds like he wants to piggyback off the work of weak emergence, but he doesn't realize that by holding on to property or reducibility, he's going into a whole different territory, something that's completely unexplored, which is why people like Mark Bedell want to say it sounds like magic, because it's not like the scientific and principled way we deal with weak emergence. Strong emergence is this very new and radical way of speaking about properties, and in a way that's just we're not really familiar with. That's why they say it's magic. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And one other thing that Chalmers says here is shoot. I had it in my mind. But now it's gone. Shoot.
Sorry if I.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So yeah, so the distinction between weak emergence and strong emergence. He basically said I had to substantiate that, but it's like here it is. His explanation of emergence is nothing. Oh yeah, spectacular. But that's what I wanted. Okay, so he talks about like water and light being strongly emergent, which is really weird, because that's definitely not strong emergence. And Chalmers has something to say here. So let me scroll down right here. So he's in the beginning of strong emergence. He says, "We have seen that strong emergence, if it exists, has radical consequences. The question that immediately rises then is, are there strongly emergent phenomenon?" So obviously that means like other than consciousness. So first. So my own view is that the answer to this question is yes. I think there is exactly one clear case of a strongly emergent phenomenon that is consciousness, right? We can say that a system is conscious when there's something that is like to be the system, the Nagel thing. It is a key fact about nature that it contains conscious systems. I am one such, and there is reason to believe that the facts about consciousness are not deducible from the yada. And so he goes on to say, I have argued this position at length elsewhere and will not repeat the case here. And he goes over the Mary argument. So he then talks about, right here, are there other cases of strong emergence besides consciousness? I think that there are no other clear cases, and that there are fairly good reasons to think that there are no other cases. Elsewhere, I've argued that given a complete catalog of the physical facts about the world, a Laplacian superbeing could in principle deduce all the high-level facts about the world, including the high-level facts about chemistry, biology, economics, and so on, which I already read. But, continuing, if this is right, then phenomenon in these domains may be weakly emergent from the physical, but they are not strongly emergent. Or, if they are strongly emergent, then strong emergence will derive wholly from a dependence on the strongly emergent phenomenon of consciousness. In short, with the exception of consciousness, it appears that all other phenomena are weakly emergent or are derived from the strongly emergent phenomenon of consciousness. So his examples of like water and light, I would just say that they are weakly emergent. And if he wants to say that they're strongly emergent, I think the only way he could even say that water is strongly emergent is by appealing to their phenomenal to water's phenomenal properties, like the properties of wetness and fluidity and stuff. Excuse me. Those are like phenomenal properties. But if he's going to say that water is strongly emergent because of its phenomenal properties, then he'll just be falling into the trap that Chalmers sets right here, which he says that if they are strongly emergent, this strong emergence will derive wholly from a dependence on the strong emergence of consciousness. So by trying to point out other examples of strong emergence, either it's just a weak emergence and it's not, or if it is, then it's just probably just like dependent on consciousness. So really, you can't really find any other examples of strong emergence other than consciousness. So consciousness just happens to be the only strongly emergent phenomenon. I don't think so. I don't know about that. Then he goes on. This is funny. So, he goes on to say that I'm kind of jumping around the video. I started at the beginning, I went to the end. Now near the middle end, he talks about me and Jason Barr as basically being just biased, and that's his argument. He said we'll never accept anything because we're biased, which obviously that's not an argument, right? You can see a pattern where he just doesn't make arguments here. He just makes fallacies. So, it's funny because granted he says probably Jacob Power is biased. He doesn't say I am. He says probably. So I'll give him that. But he does say Jason Barr is just biased, flat out. So I can tell you about myself. I wasn't always an idealist. Like I didn't even know what idealism was until a couple of years ago. I thought it was crazy that all is mind. I'm like, surely there is material stuff that exists independent of consciousness, and that there is some objective reality, and the reason that things are different is because that there are just subjects that interact with objective material reality differently. Like I thought that, but then I became convinced by just like rational arguments and stuff. And I've been talking for a long time. Maybe you told me something about Jason Barr. Maybe you would like to tell me a little bit about Jason Barr and why this claim that he is just biased and he won't accept any arguments is just ridiculous.
Yeah. Also, he's done this before with my point about Susan Schneider. He doesn't really seem to realize that this is the ad hominem circumstantial fallacy. By claiming that, somebody has a particular interest in this being true, I can just dismiss their arguments. That's not how this works. That's fallacious. You want to provide an actual counter argument. To say that someone's biased is just to attack the person. You're not addressing the argument, you're just attacking the person, and that's unnecessary, that's irrelevant to the truth. It doesn't matter who says what. At the end of the day, in that sense, it's only about what's true. So he still has to address the argument.
Right, I totally agree. But the one thing I was getting at though is not why the claim of bias is fallacious in and of itself, but why particularly it doesn't really work for Jason Barr. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to.
I'm not familiar with the specific claim, but I've seen him do this elsewhere with me personally as well. But you can continue there.
Well, what I am getting at is what you told me about his metaphysical views, that he wasn't always an idealist, correct?
Wait, can you repeat that? What did you say?
Well, I said I'm specifically referring to Jason Barr's metaphysical views, where he wasn't always an idealist, correct?
Oh, yeah, he wasn't.
Yeah, and so like you said he was. Wasn't you? Didn't you say he was a physicalist?
I can't remember which user it was. I'm not the most familiar with him. Other users are. He, I believe, was an atheist, or he's still an atheist, I think, and he was a materialist, if I'm not mistaken. And by arguing with people like Johann Rotz and other people, he sort of came around to becoming an idealist. I think Christian idealism or some other user may know a bit more about his story. But you can always ask him yourself, or you can drop a comment and say something.
Yeah, so again, this Jason Barr and I are just both examples of people who had different views, and then were just rationally persuaded for idealism by arguments. And so, even aside from the fallacious bias claim, right? Even aside from that, it doesn't even apply to us. I'm not biased for idealism. Like if I had a knockdown argument against idealism, then I would just move to something else. I wish it wouldn't be an idealist or something. Maybe logical positivism will come back. Maybe I'll be a logical positivist. Maybe I'll be a Thomist or an Augustinian or an Anselmian or something. So it's like I'm not gonna die on the hill of idealism. I think it's one of the closest things to being correct, like one of the closest metaphysical worldviews to being correct. But I'm not gonna die for it, So that's just something I wanted to address. I think that pretty much takes care of his whole video, everything I addressed, because he talks about the distinction between weak and strong emergence. I explained why he doesn't actually describe consciousness arising as strong emergence. He basically just talks about weak emergence, and he asked me to substantiate that, and I did, even though it's kind of like a trivial claim to substantiate because it's just built in within the definitions of the words themselves. He avoided a lot of my arguments. Let me see if I can screen share this. Let me see. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, so I went over a lot. So let's see here. Yeah, so this, I don't know if you can see where it says complexity here. This is where he quotes me. But then I go over causal closure. I talk about qualities. I talk about the exclusion problem here. I go down and I respond with all these, here is the argument, again, explaining the argument that property dualism collapses into substance dualism. Here is my comment talking about the distinction between weak and strong emergence. Excuse me. Which I guess, I did talk about this distinction a lot, but I think I just want to read this over just to be absolutely clear. I want to hammer this point in. So he says, so phenomenon within weak emergence do not cross the qualitative-quantitative gap. Anything that weakly emerges from something quantitative will also be quantitative. Strong emergence claims that something qualitative, something fundamentally different, which his definition agrees with, emerges from something quantitative. As Chalmers says, we can say that a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain. But truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. So this is why you will never be able to solve the explanatory gap. The existence of consciousness on strong emergence is not deducible, even in principle. If we can have a possible world that is a physical duplicate of ours, where there is no consciousness, then the existence of consciousness in our world is a brute fact, which I talked about earlier. I brought that point up earlier. Also, I say, if you're going to posit emergence as a causal phenomenon between the brain and the mind. And if you're going to posit interactionism and the reality of mental causation, then you need to posit psychophysical laws to govern this causation. But what the heck are those laws? And Chalmers, and so this is the weird thing, one of the things he denies psychophysical laws. He thinks that's just a problem for physicalism, which it's not, because physicalism denies basically a lot of physicalism denies like mental causation anyway. So like, so Chalmers says here, I'm gonna just right here. Let's see. Yeah, so this suggests that the lawful connection between physical processes and consciousness is not itself derivable from the laws of physics, but is instead a further basic law or laws of its own. The laws that express the connection between physical processes and consciousness are what we might call fundamental psychophysical laws. Yeah, so in here then he talks about being naturally supervenient instead of logically supervenient. Yeah, so so if you're not going to be an epiphenomenalist, you're going to have to posit psychophysical laws to govern to govern this non-physical causation. But he doesn't do that. So then at that point, I actually brought up this point. I brought this point up talking to Kyle, Christian Idealism. If he's going to deny that there are any psychophysical laws that govern, the mental, that basically seems like Donald Davidson's argument for the anomalism of the mental. So the anomalism of the mental says that there are no laws that correlate these interactions, and so I'm curious if his view just collapses into anomalous monism. That's a possibility. That's something I thought was kind of interesting. And so, yeah. So I think I'm done. If you want to say anything, go ahead, and then I think I'll move on to my master argument.
Yeah, sure. Just one more quick point, I guess, just to say what you're saying about psychophysical laws. William Lycan says the same thing about how the substance dualist can make the exact same appeal when it comes to this. So how is the substance dualist in trouble when it comes to them posing psychophysical laws, but the strong emergentist can get away with it? I mean, quite frankly, I think the emergentist is going to have way more problems, because now you have the problems of supervenience. Well, at least a substance dualist can say that there's a whole autonomous realm of the mental, so they can have free will. I can see how a substance dualist can try to defend things like free will and try to go for mental causation, even though they're going to have problems, while the emergentist, in a sense, is just going to be, in trouble from the get-go with causal transitivity. But yeah, I think we'll just move on to your final point there.
Sure, sounds good. And on a side note, I am kind of skeptical on whether if someone is a substance dualist. I actually am kind of skeptical whether that you actually can have free will on substance dualism, depending on, because like William Lane Craig, I don't want to get into a rant, but he holds to like Bohmian mechanics interpretation of quantum mechanics, and he's a substance dualist, and so that kind of implies that he's like a compatibilist, because the Bohmian mechanics is like purely deterministic, and so compatibilism says that free will is compatible with external determinism, and so that would be the view, is that if the Bohmian interpretation is correct, then there would be external or extrinsic determinism, but then if you want to say you have free will, then that's basically compatibilism. But I think like the free will theorem kind of rules that out. Not Simon Conway Morris. No, it was it was by Koken and Specker, I think. Koken and Spector, I don't know. The free will theorem. So I think that just kind of compatibilism just doesn't work, and I think substance dualism might hinge on compatibilism, and so that you might be able to argue from indeterminism that substance dualism is false, but that's completely other thing. Just a side rant. Making this video more longer than it needs to be. So let me change windows here. Let me do this. I don't want an infinite regress.
No, Bradley regress.
Yeah, the Bradley regress, dude. Bradley regress. Actually, no, I don't even need to because I'm recording this, so they'll be able to see this. You can just if I go into a different server, it won't cancel the call, right? If I don't think so.
I'm not sure.
Well, let's try it.
Yep, let's do it.
Oh, we're still here. Cool. I'm new to Discord. If anyone can't tell. So where is it? Okay, here it is. So here is my argument against the strong emergence of the non-physical. So I specify non-physical because I think this applies not only to the mental, but just anything non-physical in general. So the important thing to note is that Eclectic Media denies causal closure. Because that's the only way he could possibly maintain genuine mental causation. And so, if you don't know, the causal closure of the physical states that for any physical effect or event, there is a sufficient physical cause. So sufficient, we're talking in terms of like necessary and sufficient. So being a human is sufficient for being a mammal, and being a mammal is necessary for being a human. Now, there are other types of mammals, right? I think a whale is a mammal, correct? So being a whale is sufficient for being a mammal, but being a human is also sufficient for being a mammal. So if that makes sense, we can move on to the argument now. So if the causal closure of the physical is denied, actually, before I start, I think I'm just gonna run through the whole argument and then talk about the premises one by one. Does that sound good?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah, because I don't want to interrupt the flow, even though I've been doing that this whole time. So, anyway, if the causal closure of the physical is denied, then for any physical event or effect, physical causes are not sufficient to produce them. If physical causes are not sufficient to produce physical events or effects, then for any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, or the sufficient cause is non-physical, simply non-physical. If the sufficient causes of physical effects and events must be jointly physical and non-physical, then the physical is fundamental if and only if the non-physical is fundamental. If the sufficient cause of if the sufficient causes of the physical effects and events is non-physical, then the non-physical is fundamental if and only if the physical is not fundamental. The causal closure of the physical is denied. For any physical event or effect, physical causes are not sufficient to produce them. For any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, or the sufficient causes is non-physical. For any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical. Therefore, the physical is fundamental if and only if the non-physical is fundamental. Now, I have a separate option. So premise 8 is if you choose the former option. If you choose, because there's only two options. It's a dichotomy. So if you choose the joint physical and non-physical, then conclusion 1 here is entailed. But instead, if for premise 8 you say for any physical event or effect, their sufficient cause is non-physical, then the second conclusion follows that therefore the non-physical is fundamental if and only if the physical is not fundamental. So the conclusions of these are just is either some sort of fundamental dualism or something like that, or some sort of like basically idealism, or some sort of neutral monism, or like a non-reductive neutral monism or something. I don't know. So let's just go over the premises. So premise 1 is pretty uncontroversial because premise 1 is just entailed by the denial of the causal closure of the physical. If the causal closure of the physical states that for any physical event or effect there is a sufficient physical cause, then if you deny that, then for any physical event or effect, physical causes are not sufficient to produce them. That's just a denial of the causal closure of the physical. Premise 2. If physical causes are not sufficient to produce physical effects or events, then for any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, or the sufficient cause is non-physical. So here is where we get a little into the weeds here. I did kind of bring up this argument in a raw form to Eclectic Media, and he basically tried to say that that this would only like the joint physical and non-physical conclusion would only apply to sentient beings, but it actually wouldn't. But I'll explain that later. So let me read this again just to get it in my head. If physical causes are not sufficient to produce physical effects or events, then for any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, or the sufficient cause is non-physical. Okay, yeah. So these two are the only other options that could possibly obtain. If physical causes are not sufficient to produce if physical causes are not sufficient to produce physical effects, then if you think that physical effects and events exist, then if physical causes by themselves didn't cause them, then either there is a physical and some non-physical cause that like together are sufficient, or you would have to say that something non-physical is just sufficient for it, because there couldn't be anything else. Does that make sense? First of all.
Yeah, I actually have the argument right here in front of me. You
Good.
can just sort of see. Yeah, you can see. I think perhaps we can put it in the description or some other way for people can see it.
Yeah. I'll probably like
possible.
copy paste it and put it in the description, or maybe pin it.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. I think it all seems to add up here. It's like whether you accept causal closure or not. I mean, I don't know, man. Like, I'm not gonna lie here. Like, when it comes to strong emergence, just I'm not the most informed on it. I'm no expert. I've looked into it just a bit, but
Yeah, neither am I for sure.
mean, to me, I mean, this may sound like a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's in more contemporary terms, just like another version of the mind-body problem, is what I keep going back to. Even if you want to have epiphenomenalism, let's say you want to run with that, having this physical to non-physical, you're right back to this very same question, no matter what direction it's going. I'm just not seeing whether you have an open or closed sort of cosmos here, it's the same problem over and over again.
Sure.
Just rearing its head in a different way. And that may be a little too simple or something, but that's just what it looks like. Even when I'm just looking at this argument, as sophisticated as it is, and I think this is a very good argument. It's sort of like it's sort of bringing us back home to this classic problem that just keeps haunting us. It keeps resurrecting.
No, I agree. So does this does that second premise make sense to you? That if physical causes aren't powerful enough to produce physical effects or events, then a physical cause is going to need some help. It's going to need some help from a non-physical cause, or another option is just to have the non-physical cause be sufficient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, because those are the only other options, you know. And so premise 3 is if the sufficient causes of physical effects and events must be jointly physical and non-physical, then the physical is fundamental if and only if the non-physical is fundamental. And so this is the if and only if is a material bad conditional here, so it's entailed both ways. So here's the thing: if eclectic media takes the physical to be fundamental, and generally strong property dualism with strong emergence does. They take the physical to be fundamental, and they take the physical thing to be a substance, and then emergent properties. So if you think that the physical is fundamental, and you think that the sufficient causes of physical effects and events must be jointly physical and non-physical, and the physical is fundamental, for there to even be any physical effects or events at all, since there is some sort of joint causation, then if the physical is fundamental, the non-physical would have to be fundamental too.
Yeah, that sounds like a lapse to panpsychism.
Essentially, premise 3. I think premise 3 could be compatible with substance dualism as well. But so like premise 3 would essentially be that just collapses into panpsychism or substance dualism, or something of maybe, I don't know, it wouldn't be neutral monism, because that the neutral monism posits that neither are fundamental. It's just some neutral thing. So premise 4: if the sufficient causes of physical effects and events is non-physical and not jointly physical and non-physical, then the non-physical is fundamental if and only if the physical is not fundamental. So if you're going to say that physical causes are not sufficient to produce physical effects and events, but non-physical causes are sufficient to produce physical effects, and you think that there are physical effects and events that exist, then that would mean that the non-physical has to precede the physical, because the existence of physical effects and events depends on the non-physical causes. So if the physical is not fundamental, that would imply that the non-physical is fundamental, because that's the thing that causes physical things to exist. And so premises 5 through 8 are just the first 4 are just the ifs, and then the 5 through 8 are the just acceptance of these things. So again, the causal closure of the physical is denied. Eclectic Media denies the causal closure of the physical. So for any physical, so that means, following from premise 2, for any physical effect or event, physical causes are not sufficient to produce them. Or sorry, that's 1. So following from premise 2, for any physical event or effect, their sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, or the sufficient cause is non-physical. So, and so again, either if you choose that the sufficient causes of physical effects and events are jointly physical and non-physical, then if you think the physical is fundamental, then that would entail that the non-physical is also fundamental, because if the existence of physical effects and events requires there to be something non-physical, and you think the physical is fundamental, then that entails that the non-physical is also fundamental, or nothing physical could even exist, or no physical effects or events could even exist. So that seems like the most reasonable option. If you take the other option and you say down here, if you say for any physical effect or event, their sufficient causes must be non-physical, for reasons I explained already, that would mean that the non-physical, that your view would have to just collapse into the view that the non-physical is fundamental, and then the physical is not fundamental. Now, before I continue, I checked this argument with a logic bot, and it is deductively valid. It's logically valid, and let me hop back into the thing here. Let me turn my screen share on. I actually have a little thing here. Let me bring it up right here. So this is my argument. It's P implies Q, Q implies R or S, R implies T, which implies U, and U implies T. S implies V, where V implies W and W implies V. P, Q, R or S, R. Therefore, T implies U and U implies T. Or if you say S, then it would be V implies W, W implies V. So either way, it's deductively valid. Here's the truth table. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly deductively valid. So if you object to the argument, you're going to have to object to one of the premises. Yeah. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I think. So what are this might be it. This might be it. So what are some? Do you have any more thoughts? Any more thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I guess this is mainly a response to his videos about us, but there's a lot more objections that we could raise against him. We've talked before about what it means to be physical. What exactly is the physical? Is it over and above the mental? Does it even exist at all? There's arguments to think there is no such thing, or that maybe it's just reducible to the mental. And there's just all sorts of other objections that we could bring up here, but I guess we don't want to go too far. Maybe we can save those for another video.
Right.
But,
I think we kind of got everything that he said in the videos and more. So I wanted to quickly explain. He said for the conclusion that the sufficient causes must be jointly physical and non-physical, he said that only applies to sentient beings, which is not true. If something, so like his position would be physical things do have sufficient causes until consciousness comes into play with subjects, and then so like the physical properties of subjects and the physical substance of a subject, that's when the causal closure of the physical doesn't work. But you can't say that because either physical causes are sufficient for physical effects or events, or it isn't. Like they either the causes either are sufficient or they aren't. You can't like, oh yeah, sometimes it's sufficient, sometimes it's not. Like you can't say like you can't say being a human is sometimes sufficient for being a mammal and sometimes not. Like if something is sufficient, then it just is simpliciter. It just is in and of itself. So it's absolutely. So you can't like pick and choose sufficiency here. So that objection doesn't work. So basically, in a comment, Eclectic Media said that strong emergence is basically his last I don't know what the phrase is, like his last hope, I guess, his last bunker. I don't know. It's his last space to kind of reside in. And he said if strong emergence is refuted, then he'll basically probably just become an idealist or something. And so I think this does a pretty good job of at least I think even if it doesn't work, I think it's a very interesting argument against strong emergence. I don't want to like boast or anything, but I came up with this myself. It might have been already done before, but if it has been done before, I'm not familiar with it. But I do think it works. I think if you reject causal closure, then these are the consequences that's going to happen. You can't have strong emergence. If you reject causal closure and you think the mental has causal powers, you're going to collapse into some fundamental dualism, either some fundamental panpsychism or fundamental substance dualism or something like that. That's just what's going to happen. And if you don't reject causal closure, there are a couple problems. If you don't reject causal closure, but you say that the mental has causal powers, then that's just overdetermination. Because if physical causes are sufficient to produce physical effects, and then you're positing some extra causal explanation, that doesn't make any sense. Because how could it be causally explanatory if the physical is already sufficient? It being sufficient means being complete. So it's like you can't have like a sufficient explanation here and then an extra one, because the first one already explains it completely. So like the other thing isn't even an explanation. And then also if you want to accept causal closure, you'll collapse into epiphenomenalism, right? So
yeah.
I have actually on this. I'll bring up my. Let's see if it. Yeah. So here's a couple models right here. So this is like a non-interactionist causal closure model. And as you can see, there's no interaction between the mental properties and physical properties. This is essentially epiphenomenalism. So that's the kind of what you get on epiphenomenalism. Or sorry, if you accept causal closure, you get epiphenomenalism. But then there are problems with epiphenomenalism too. It's just self-evidently false. If it's true, like propositions about the mental are caused by something non-mental, like which is really weird. There's a ton of evidence in neuroscience that shows that the mind causes changes to the brain, that the mind can actually like transform neural structures and stuff like that. Inspiring philosophy goes into that a lot. And then here you get the interactionist model that has problems. If the causal, again, like the causal transitivity problem, like you could just cut out the mental property here and then just get physicalism, it's like unneeded. So anyway, I think that's pretty much done. I think we got everything. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I think you've pretty much nailed it, man. I think the problems of strong emergence just might be the final nail in the coffin here. And I think you did a really good job of elucidating the cost of trying to deny causal closure. Like I always try to argue for idealism by going with the current. Most seem to accept causal closure. And I'm going to argue that if you accept irreducible consciousness and mental causation with causal closure, you're going to be right at home with idealism. Idealism gives you everything you want. It's more parsimonious, no mind-body problem, none of that stuff. So that's another topic for another day. I think you've just about done it there. Well done.
Thank you, and you too. Your responses to his points were very eloquent, and I think you made some really good arguments. So that'll do it. If I hope Eclectic Media watches this, I hope you watch it. And if you're watching now, I hope you'll give some responses. If you want to just do it in a comment, maybe you could make another video. But honestly, I don't. I think this might just kind of end. I hope this ends the debate, because I going back and forth does get really tiresome. You know, but you know, if you know, Eclectic Media, if you do make a response, and personally, this is how I'm gonna react. If I don't find your response very persuasive, then I'm probably just gonna not even respond to it. You know, I think this will be sufficient to persuade people if his response is not very good. But that's it. That is the response to Eclectic Media's critiques of myself and monistic idealism, and the hopeful refutation of strong emergence via the argument I gave. Thank you, everyone who watches this. If anyone watches this at all, it's an hour-long video, so if you do watch the whole thing, I'm very appreciative, and you have a good attention span. That'll be all. Yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Thank you for
Thank you
watching.
very much. God bless.